Dear colleagues, researchers, and students, welcome to our webinar on a timely and critical issue, the war on Iran, domestic and regional implications. In his analysis of Middle Eastern studies, Fred Holliday characterizes the Middle East as a penetrated region where external powers have long played a decisive role in shaping political dynamics. In many ways, the developments we are witnessing today represent yet another episode in this enduring pattern of extra-regional involvement in the region, along with domestic and regional complexities. The preemptive US-Israel strikes on Iran, launched on 28 February 2026, have already sparked intense debate about whether the Middle East is approaching a new and critical threshold in its evolving balance of power. At this point, I would like to draw on an analysis that we authored together with Abdullah Alkaheri, who is also going to be our moderator today, that has just been published by Marmara University Center for IR. As we argue also in this work, with the onset of the US-Israel war on Iran, we are entering yet another cycle of rapid change in Middle East security landscape in the post-7 October era. The depth and speed of these transformations require analytical approaches that capture both domestic, regional, and global complexities. Such analyses do not render discussions of regime change or changes in the behavior of Iranian regime obsolete. Rather, they compel us to situate these possibilities within the context of an emerging new order, one that may reshape not only regional dynamics, but also broader global alignments. In this sense, what is currently unfolding in the Middle East should not be viewed solely through the lenses of the Iranian regime. It must be understood as a part of a broader geopolitical reconfiguration whose implications extend well beyond the region itself. We are particularly pleased to have with us today a distinguished guest speaker whose research and scholarly expertise focus extensively on Iran and US-Iran relations. Assistant Professor Dr. Gülriz Şen's works have made important contributions to the understanding of various dimensions of these complex relations. Without further ado, I would now like to give the floor to our moderator, research assistant and instructor Abdullah Alkaheri for today's panel. And there, Gülriz Şen, thank you very much for being with us today. We look forward to a stimulating discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of the International Relations and Political Science Department at the Economics and Administrative Sciences Faculty at the Near East University, I would like to warmly welcome you all on today's webinar. We are very pleased to have you with us and hope that you will have an engaging and insightful session. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today from Ankara, Assistant Professor Dr. Gülriz Şen. Dr. Gülriz Şen is an Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at TOBB University of Economics and Technology, Ankara, Turkey. She received her PhD and Bachelor in Science degrees from Middle East Technical University, Department of International Relations, and holds an MA in Conflict and Sustainable Peace Studies from Katholieke Universiteit Leuven from Belgium, where she pursued her studies as Gen Mon Scholar. Her major academic interests comprise Middle East politics, with a particular focus on international relations of Persian Gulf and the Levant and gender in global politics. Dr. Şen published a Turkish translation of her award-winning PhD thesis from Middle East Technical University Press in 2016 on the theme of Iran's post-revolutionary foreign policy vis-à-vis the United States. She also authored articles, book chapters, and policy brief on Iran-US, Iran-Turkey, and Iran-Gulf Cooperation Council affairs. Her latest publication include Turkey-Iran affairs since the Arab uprising, contending strategic depth, and Turkey's ambiguous strategic autonomy. Also, she published The Political Economy of Turkey-Iran Relations, a discussion of variegated capitalism and underperformance of Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. For an efficient, time-efficient, and maintaining a flow of the session, Please feel free to drop your question in the comment box for the Q&A in session, which will follow the talk. Without a further ado, I would like to welcome on board Dr. Gülriz, and the mic is yours. Welcome, Dr. Gülriz.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today to discuss the momentous and consequential developments in our region. So I'm very, happy to be here with you today, and thanks for the generous introduction. And as Nur Hocam, very succinctly put it, we're having significant days as to Middle East regional order, and Iran is once again at the center of it. So today in my talk, I would like to focus on the war on Iran through its domestic and regional implications. And I will first make a brief introduction by giving the patterns and trajectory of the war so far. We're on the 14th day of the joint US-Israel war on Iran. And in the past 2 weeks, per Iranian officials, more than 1,300 people are killed in Iran. Many are still trapped under the rubbles. More than 3 million Iranians are internally displaced. Iranian cities, hospitals, schools, civilian and energy infrastructure, and its cultural heritage came under attack. Besides, Israel is also attacking state institutions, army headquarters, and police stations in order to bring, a regime change or weaken the regime, so as this calculated social protest would start, and then these states want to see the end of the Iranian regime through this war. And although it is mainly the Iranians who bear the brunt of physical destruction, as well as war's ecological and social calamities, as we have witnessed in the acid rain and the black rain following the attacks on Iran's oil depots and refineries, this war is also a regional war. So when we talk about this war, we have this multiple levels of analysis. So it's not only about Iranian state, regime, and society, it's also about the region, and it's also about global economy and global energy. So the war swiftly regionalized as expected, because this was something Iran was already mentioning before the war as a deterrence to the upcoming attack. And, this regionalization shouldn't surprise us, because Iran is now targeting the Gulf states, especially for hosting American bases, which Tehran sees as a legitimate target in its war with the United States, as well as, Iran retaliates against Israel with continuous rounds of ballistic missile barrages using its more advanced hypersonic and supersonic, missiles, which can be launched with tons of warheads. So this time, Iranian attacks against Israel are less in numbers and quantity, but with greater destructive capacity. As we, return to Gulf, Iran hits U.S. diplomatic missions in the Gulf as well, also targeting the energy and civilian infrastructures of the Gulf states, which indeed drives a significant wedge between Iran and its Gulf neighbors. The war so far resulted in force majeures in oil production. The attacks against the very busy airports in the Gulf brought this connectivity to a standstill. So this war so far harmed Gulf's image as the hub of global connectivity, tourism, and technology. Besides, Lebanon's Hezbollah and Iraq's Iran-backed popular mobilization units also joined this, war effort by Iran against Israel and the United States. So there is one reason for this, because we haven't seen this, excess of resistance inclusion this much in the June war, in the 12-day war in June 2025, because this time these groups were also reacting against the decapitation attack against Iran's former supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Hundreds are killed in Beirut and southern Lebanon. Thousands are already displaced. Beirut is heavily bombarded. And as of yesterday, we also started seeing Iran and Hezbollah's first joint operation against Israel staged from Lebanon. And as to the global consequences, the war already had, highly crucial ramifications for global economy and global energy, with Iran's effective closure of Strait of Hormuz, which left oil and LNG tankers, likewise ships carrying petrochemical produces, which are so vital for food security and agriculture, stranded in the strait. International Energy Agency declared this situation, the ongoing war, the largest supply disruption in the history of global oil markets. So far, the war at least took 7% of the global oil, output from the supplies. Oil prices are going up. They already reached $100 per barrel in a very short time, and they still risk rising up as the war drags on. So the cost on natural gas also increased rapidly. According to a recent report, the Gulf already lost 15 billion in their energy revenues. So the war seems, implicating not only Iran per se, but the region and the global, politics and economy. Dubbed as Epic Fury by the United States and the Roaring Lion by Israel, and named as True Promise 4 by Iran, the war is not the first time that the US, Israel, and Iran are directly mired in an armed conflict. We should rather take this war as a new stage of the previous episode of 12-Day War, which happened in June 2025, and that war ended with a very fragile ceasefire. And since then, apparently, all actors were getting ready for a new round of confrontation. Because as we have seen in the post-October 7 Middle East, the rules of engagement and deterrence radically shifted. And also Iran's regional defense lines through axis of resistance, they were seriously crumbled. And all this shifting environment actually transformed previously shadow war between Iran and Israel into an open out confrontation since 2024. And again, we can see some similarities between the 12-Day War and the current one, because this one also started in the midst of diplomatic talks between Iran and the United States to bring a peaceful resolution of the nuclear crisis. But these, talks are once again, cut and sabotaged by Israeli attacks. This time, jointly by the United States as well. And in the first war, we have seen a much clearer and limited, objective by the United States. It was mainly obliterating Iran's nuclear program with its Operation Midnight Hammer. But recently, we can see some ambiguities and inconsistencies in the way the United States talks about its war goals. So it is sometimes destruction of ballistic missiles and missile launchers, also, eradicating Iran's nuclear program. Now, recently, eradicating Iran's navy is added. Sometimes U.S. talks about regime change, and sometimes officials don't mention it. So we see some sort of strategic ambiguity in the way United States talks about its objectives, and these objectives have not been, thoroughly shared with the public opinion in the U.S. or with the Congress members. So the U.S. did not take enough time to at least justify this war to its public. And for Israel, in both cases, both in the 12-Day War and later in what we see in the current war, there's a clear objective of regime change, even though not this immediate fall of the Iranian regime so far seems to be shifting their analysis, and they now again mention how it is up to the Iranian people, to complete this process, and I will talk about it in greater detail in the coming parts of my talk. If I am to give a bit historical context, of course, we can say that even though we recently see this direct military confrontation between these actors, obviously there is a long history of animosity between Iran, United States, and Israel since 1979, and we see how this ideological and geopolitical conflict evolved through shadow war, cyber warfare, economic sanctions, and a new threshold has been achieved, and now we have it in the form of an armed conflict which threatens region and world peace. And if we are to look very briefly into Iran's, established order, Nizam, this was established back in 1979, Iranian Revolution. It was a revolution of broad coalition of social forces, overthrowing the Pahlavi dynasty, which was discredited not only for its despotism, but also its subservience to American policies in the Middle East. So out of this revolution, a theocracy was established in Iran, and it actually, it was built on an uneasy coexistence of theocracy at the helm, but also some republican elements, which drives in, popular will to a limited extent. So this system in Iran has been consolidated through war and populism. So especially the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for 8 years, played a very significant role in the making of Iranian elites, Iranian state structures, elimination of political rivals, people's, rallying around the flag through, the sacred defense idea, blending Islamism and nationalism. And then onwards, we have seen critical turning points in Iran's political history. In the 1990s, there was a tide of reformism, but later in the 2000s, we have seen how both state-society relations and how Iran's regional and international affairs greatly securitized, especially with the growing crisis with United States and Israel. And in the 2000s, we also see the IRGC's rise in domestic politics, economy, and foreign policy of Iran as, as the major pillar of this system. And their rise effectively hampered any hopes for reforming the system from within along Republican lines. And the hardliners were empowered with their growing conflict with the United States, while, Iranian society bear the brand of sanctions, and this did not really led to any sort of change in state behavior, but it actually led to the shrinking of Iran's middle classes. And state-society relations, both because of economic mismanagement, but as well as the economic sanctions, these relations were constantly rocked by socioeconomic protest. And this is especially the case since 2017. We have also seen nationwide, women-led Mahsa Amini protest back in 2022. So there was one civil rights movement going on, but also Iranian socioeconomic problems are also reflected in, in the increasing intensity of social protest against the regime in Iran in the last, let's say, 10 years. And recently, we have seen another wave of protests in the day protests, and this was actually brought by the currency crisis, which was triggered by sanctions, and it resulted in one of the gravest massacres, with thousands of Iranians killed under a digital blackout. And especially this was during, January 8 and 9. And this time around, we also saw a relatively high death toll among the state security personnel. But even by the, regime's, declaration, thousands of people are killed in these protests. And at this juncture, we see greater external pressure to steer regime change in Iran. And we see how the son of the deposed Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Pahlavi, is making a call for people to fill the streets. And This was also the first time that, an American president pledged to move to protect the Iranian civilians, because Trump was posting, help is on the way. This has also triggered, more people coming to the streets with the hope that the regime would, might fall instantly. So, what we see is, while Iranians were mourning, a limited opportunity for diplomacy was pushed by the regional actors, which were afraid of the coming war. And we have seen 3 rounds of diplomacy in the nuclear talks. And despite last-minute publicity by Oman's foreign minister of this positive moves and progress in the talks, sadly, the diplomatic encounters did not succeed, and the war broke out. And during the talks in Geneva, Iran rejected submission or capitulation and stick to its perennial red line of uranium enrichment at home, while it was showing some sort of flexibility on the stockpiling and the percentage of its enrichment. But seemingly, as we understand from the news, US already decided to attack Iran to start this war on the grounds that there was an imminent threat from Iran against the United States. And we also understand that the US negotiators couldn't really grasp the content and likely outcomes of the concessions Iran was, offering in these nuclear talks. So it was a missed opportunity, which was followed by the most feared but rather expected new round of war between Iran, United States, and Israel. So the war started at a time of, Iran's moment of weakness. So Iran is facing an existential crisis. And even though Iran long referred to the Syrian war as an existential crisis, we can see that the current developments show that this is the existential crisis for Iran, and which would be very consequential for the trajectory of the state and the regime once the war ends. So domestically, I talked about why it was a moment of weakness, because Iran, the state in Iran is suffering from a severe crisis in state-society relations. But also, regionally speaking, we should also underline that the ongoing war is an outcome of Iran's weakening position in the Middle East regional order, especially in the post-October 7 regional politics. Since then, Iran's regional defense lines, its allies in the axis of resistance, they lost most of their power. So Iran's defense lines are crumbled with continuous Israeli attacks against Hezbollah and Hamas in terms of leadership, fighters, and arms. And obviously the fall of the Assad regime, which was the backbone of the axis of resistance, also significantly weakened Iran's strategic depth in the region. So we see how Iran's power and influence in the region face significant setbacks, and all these included this provided a calculation on the side of United States and Israel that this was the most opportune time to attack Iran for exacting highly consequential outcomes for the future of Iran and for the future of politics in Iran. If we look into, Iran's resilience and war strategies so far, we should underline the fact that the war opened with this Israeli salvo immediately decapitating, the head of this nizam, the system. It killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. But as we have seen in the last 2 weeks, this strategy of decapitation, which was exercised along other axes of resistance, partners, actors, it did not bring an immediate collapse of the Iranian regime. So what Iran is doing is trying to survive by absorbing the shocks, but Iran is also trying to exact a heavy price on its militarily superior adversaries to establish a robust deterrence so that there won't be a next time for getting attacked. So Iran is trying to establish a deterrence, which it lost throughout this, period since October, 7 in the Middle East. And it doesn't only seek a ceasefire. I mean, so far it didn't give any signals that it is looking for a ceasefire, but if the war is to concluded, Iran wants a complete cessation of hostilities. And as Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian already released, Iran would be looking for war reparations and significant security assurances to prevent future attacks. So that is something to be mentioned here. And aware of the likely decapitation strategies of its adversaries, Iran already decentralized its war strategy. So now, as being highly debated, Iran is professing mosaic defense with autonomy of the local forces alongside its pre-planned war strategy under former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So regionalization of the conflict was a pre-planned strategy, but the way it's operationalized pretty much depends on this mosaic defense, framework. And there we see asymmetric warfare. Plus, obviously there is a strategic ambiguity, and this mosaic defense may also create unintended and unprecedented risks for Iran's war efforts. But so far, Iran held on, and it actually resisted these attacks, and it's proved quite resilient in terms of its war efforts. And this time around, the remnants of the resistance axis are also a part of the war, as I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk, except for the expected entry of the Houthis in Yemen. So there might be their inclusion in the coming days, because there are already messages coming from the Houthi leadership is that, their strategic patience is running thin and their hands are on the trigger. And if such an eventuality occurs, it will totally disrupt the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea as well. So this would have enormous implications, again, for security and global economy and energy. In the meanwhile, after 1 week of deliberation and in a show of defiance and continuity, and not necessarily paying attention to, how it look like, because, it looks like a dynastic theocracy or theocratic monarchy in Iran, the Assembly of Experts chose Ali Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, as Iran's new supreme leader. And he only yesterday actually addressed the nation through a written speech, because he's wounded, and although he's declared safe and sound, I think he's not ready to address Iranian people in person. And during this transition period, we see a temporary leadership taking charge, and we see how some hardliner figures are actually claiming the ground and running Iran's war efforts. So for that, we can give examples of Iran's Supreme National Security Council Secretary Ali Larijani, and also the Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf is also highly involved in Iran's war efforts. And Iran is in no short supply of warriors who have been raised by this experience of Iran-Iraq war. So the major elites aligned or part of the IRGC, they already experienced the war. So they have an idea and experience of war, and that pretty much also affects the way Iran tackles this war. And Iran wants to hold escalation dominance. It wants to determine the end of the war, and it wants to force the United States, to a ceasefire by exacting the highest cost. And this is not only in terms of military confrontation, but even more so with the global impact of the war on economy and energy markets. And as to the new message released by Mujtaba Khamenei yesterday, he also says that Iran would keep Strait of Hormuz closed. So this would be a significant leverage in the hands of Iran, so that the actors, the adversaries, should think about this as they calculate their further moves in the Iranian conflict. So one major issue is, when will this war end? So President Trump is talking about unconditional surrender, and he also talked about that the war would end soon to pacify and calm down the oil markets, but which did not really work, as we see from the rising prices. So President Trump may call it over once achieving some of these goals, which keep changing from explanation to explanation, and because U.S. casualties in this war may strain him in domestic politics, and he wouldn't want to pursue this because of the rising cost of energy. But he also released some defiant messages yesterday, saying that the oil prices may increase and that would also benefit us. So, but still he would, adhere to the idea of, eliminating Iran's nuclear threats, which is of greater interest and importance to the US than the rising oil prices. So we keep fluctuations in the messages and narratives as to when the war will end. But obviously, talking about more tangible issues, the war effort also depends on the stockpiles. So this is, for Iran, this is about ballistic missiles, missile launchers, the suicide drones, but Iran has an arsenal which is not depleted yet. And according to, Iranian officials, they are ready for undertaking this for like 2 or 3 months, and they can even prolong it. So we see all these, messages of prolonging the war and not blinking an eye. And for the United States as well, the news of limited ammunitions keep coming, and I think this is also a messaging. So no one has endless resources for this war, especially the TOBB air defense batteries, which are highly expensive to produce and which are also limited in stock, can be a problem. So the projectiles are not maybe running short because of Iran's continuous attacks. And we have already seen some news that 1/3 of these very, strategic and expensive air defense batteries were already used in Israeli defense back in, 12-day war. And that is something to be noted. Obviously, the war effort is also related with, elite and military resolve, since Iran faces a moment of existential crisis. Thus, we can argue that all the elites and the military forces are tightly mobilized, and they also say that this time again, Iran is pursuing sacred defense. Likewise, the war with Iraq in the 80s. And despite all these structural deficiencies, Iran is resisting because elites retain cohesion, and we see a great mobilization for the war effort, and not capitulating is a major goal either in the diplomatic talks or in the wartime. So survival instinct puts Iranians even more mobilized in terms of regime dynamics. And also the messages from the United States, which not only target the Iranian regime, but also talk of breaking the Iranian nation or depicting Iran as a nation of terror and hate. This also creates some backlash among the Iranian society, and this may also increase the possibility of rally around the flag effect, at least among certain segments of the society. And we also see, new thresholds of escalation. Iran already reportedly laid mines in the Strait of Hormuz, and US senators are talking about a possible US boots on the ground strategy. So all these issues keep prolonging the war. So, and I think one major issue about the duration of this war is all these talks about and all these analogies of messianic war. So I also see that this hegemonic masculinity as well as this references to some esoteric analogies. It may make it impossible to climb down, and it may lock the United States in this war. So as some authors talk about escalation traps, so that may be very consequential for the duration of this war. And obviously, one limitation on the United States could be the fracturing of the MAGA coalition, because in the United States we see this clash between America first versus Israel first. So that may also may have an impact as the war drags on. We would see more domestic criticism coming not only from the Congress but from the very within MAGA coalition who supported Trump. So obviously wars are, major international developments, but they're major social developments. In IR, we keep talking about how wars constitute the states. And obviously, even though Iranian regime seems intact, the war will transform Iranian state and society. And here we have some patterns, and we have obviously the element of contingency. But if we look into regime's direction so far, we see how hardliners and IRGC's preferences prevail in Mujtaba Khamenei's election to supreme leader position. So that signals a continuity with the previous era. Even further domination of the political trajectory of Iran by the IRGC, as Iran is now a warring state. So these are extraordinary times, and in these times, obviously, politics and society and all these symbolisms, they got militarized. So Mujtaba Khamenei is the son of the martyr Imam. So we see how Iran is defying Trump. And in some ways, interestingly, Trump might have helped his election by opposing him, by pushing the system to elect him so as to show defiance against the United States. He might be a weaker supreme leader originally, but then he has to build some authority. Likewise, his father, and but even though he didn't have some direct experience in state running, he was heavily involved in the running of Beit Rehberi. So he has been very, very much involved alongside his father's running of the state and society. So Iranian people have so many issues with Khamenei, and it's also a wonder whether he will hold to power, whether he will be safe in the face of continuous threats. So all these dynamics will be very much shaped by the war dynamics as well. So we'll see more of these dynamics once the war ends, and we'll see how state-society relations will unfold. I think the regime change is still a goal for United States and Israel, especially for Israel. But through aerial power, they see that won't be possible, so they count on Iranian people to take to the streets. This is also a message by Reza Pahlavi to his support base inside Iran. But here I would like to talk more on not only regime change but also on the possibility of state collapse, which is more dangerous, because we see international intervention and war destroying not only the regime targets, but also public order, infrastructure, and all the available means of statecraft. So even though the regime may not fall imminently, we see that the state institutions, the state finances, the state infrastructure, they are severely hampered by the war. And once this war ends, and if the regime stays intact, Iran will face the burden of reconstruction. I think especially Israel is calculating that all these burdens of war would trigger new economic crisis, and that would further lead to socioeconomic protest for implosion of the regime. And their foreign policy, we're talking about the domestic and regional implications of this war, and obviously we have to talk about Iran's foreign policy. So what sort of road Iran will take to survive once this war finishes is also a very critical question. So it may act pragmatically, taking some necessary reforms and try to rebuild its ties with its society and also with the region. But it may also follow a more hardliner and repressive system, because we see all these vengeful or more revengist narrative by the new supreme leader. But at the end of the day, this is war effort, and we can understand this more robust posturing. But obviously, at the end of the day after will definitely demand some sort of moderation and pragmatic choices, as Iran, would like to keep the state and revolution intact, and for that it would have to moderate. And the paths that will be taken will depend very much upon the supreme leader's vision, the elite cohesion, and how the IRGC would act, as well as the scale of economic destruction, the restoration of institutional capacity, alongside the positioning of Iran's diverse social opposition. And as to the regional environment, once the war ends, we will significantly watch out how Iran-Gulf relations would, unfold, because we see the Gulf is deeply hurt and harmed, and it's not simply a damage on their economy or reputation, but the very security of the sub-region is now at stake. So Iran may be further marginalized, especially due to its strained relations with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, because at the time, Iran is concentrated more on the moment and not the day after. And this is sometimes tantamount to burning bridges with neighbors at this critical moment of survival. And even though Supreme Leader, mentioned in his, message yesterday that Iran values, relations with the Gulf neighbors, it would be very challenging to rebuild these ties. But obviously, Gulf states also understand the limitations of U.S. defenses and how the U.S. presence in the region made them vulnerable. So they may not immediately give away, their relations with the U.S., but I think there will be new negotiations. The region may also look for pacts for non-aggression or collective security arrangements. But for all this to happen, we need to await the end of the war. And I think one major problem in the offing in sites is, the possibility of nuclear proliferation in the region, because once the war is over, with a more hardline government in Iran, Iran may take the political decision to turn its nuclear program into a weapons program. So there stands a danger of proliferation for Iran, because Iran would see nuclear capability as the ultimate guarantee of its survival. And if this happens, more states will follow in the region. A nuclear arms race may be in the offing, and that would be very critical for Middle East politics. Plus, domestic politics, state capacity, cohesion dynamics will also be drastically impacted in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, where we see, local allies are involved in the war, and these countries already became battlegrounds themselves. So it's not simply rebuilding of Iran, but the countries which became the battlegrounds of this extended regional war. And also, once weakening Iran and putting the entire region in jeopardy, we can also expect more counterbalancing strategies of the Middle East actors vis-a-vis Israel. So that would be quite interesting to watch. So this is definitely, despite so many uncertainties, this is definitely a significant shift in the Middle East regional order, with excessive violence and war. So if I'm to conclude, war was constitutive of the post-1979 Iran. It helped the consolidation of the Islamic Republic with sacred defense, by blending Islamism and nationalism. It marginalized its political contenders. It made the state the provider of basic goods for a war-torn population. So obviously all this was back in the 80s, and state-society, relations endured a lot in the last 5 decades since then. But we're yet to see whether the ongoing war on Iran will have similar foundational impact on Iranian politics and society, and help the state and the regime to survive, and whether we're witnessing to the birth of Iran's Third Republic as something, as scholars of Middle East and Iran, that will be watching thoroughly. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gülriz. It was very comprehensive briefing. Talk. It was very great. You wrapped it up very well for us and made it clear, discussing a lot of things regarding U.S. narrative, objectives change, the domestic briefing, the implication, and the regional repercussions, and so many other things. And we have very interesting questions, and we are very short in time, so we'll make sure to take as much as we can. We will have also Nur Köprülü, Professor Nur Köprülü. She's interested and eager, and I think she has a very important question to you regarding the war in Iran.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Gülriz Hocam. As Abdullah also mentioned, I would like to also thank you very much, because it's a very complex topic, but you really, gave us an insightful information, not just from the regional point of view, but also domestically. And it didn't go unnoticed that you also referred to a gender-based approach. I have to underline this. And then you also highlighted the scenarios that might, we can speculate about. So here is my short question. Some analysts argue that Iranian regime seems like it may achieve, at least relatively speaking, a short-term win, or whether we can call it as a win, I don't know, because you also mentioned about this destroyed infrastructure and everything. But let's say if it may achieve a relatively speaking short-term win, as long as it avoids a decisive defeat, how might this perception influence short-term expectations regarding the regional reconfiguration, especially considering the growing strategic role of the Gulf monarchies since the Arab uprisings? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this excellent question. Nur Hocam, I think this short-term win, or not submitting to the enemy's will, or showing some defiance and achieving sacred defense of the homeland, this may actually bring some Iranians under the flag. So this would have some, positive impact on the legitimacy of the system, because there would be a war which has been not, given away, and Iran would build on the narrative of victory once the war finishes. But that pretty much depends on, forcing the United States to take the ceasefire decision. And, there Iran would push for further reparations and security guarantees. If the, state and the regime emerges victorious out of this otherwise quite destructive war, I think the regional actors, which are quite, tired and very exhausted of this war, would still seek to, come together and find a modus vivendi at least. So there will be lots of mistrust, and obviously the war will, leave a mark on Iran-Gulf relations. But anyhow, what I see from the, Gulf's, statements is that still Iran is their neighbor. So they have to find a common ground to survive together. And they are already questioning, like actors like Oman are already, they are questioning the value of US, security umbrella for them, because they are also, resentful against the US that it is primarily the security of Israel being, pursued, but they have been, pushed to the crossfire. So for that reason, if the regime is there to stay, it will seek some sort of reconciliation with its, Gulf neighbors, as we can see in the statements of the new supreme leader, and also the apology of Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian. So they understand that good neighborly relations would be very essential for the day after, not only providing a good security environment, but also for reconstruction of Iranian economy. This was what happened in the 1990s. So the detente period back then was primarily motivated by the political economy considerations of the system. So, and I think Gulf, despite all these resentment, would be also willing to establish new ties, but there will be some more tense negotiations, I guess, because this issue would be brought up. So the mistrust has intensified. The last 3 years, all these attempts to reconcile and prevent a regional war seems to be a bit defeated. But at the end of the day, since they will continue to exist in this sub-region, I think the Gulf and Iran would struggle to find ways of coexistence. Plus, a possible Israeli domination of regional politics would also, make Gulf to stand nearby Iran, not for the sake of their love of the Iranian regime, but also for regional power distribution. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do also have other questions. Very interesting one. We have here from a colleague in the Department of International Relations, Dr. Asst asking a very interesting question. What is your take on the role of China in the conflict? And in fact, it's linked because there's a followed question also adding the role of Russia too. Mm-hmm. So what is the role of China and Russia in this conflict?
Thank you so much for these excellent questions. Actually, I was planning to refer to them, but for time's sake, I just thought they would come up as questions. So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to reflect on that dimension as well. Russia and China are currently taking a more indirect role in this war because they don't want to be severely implicated, but obviously they're helping out Iran as more news and reports show. If I am to start with China. China's, China-Iran relations are built a lot on the oil dimension, and China receives Iranian oil at a very discount rate, and despite sanctions, they preserve this relationship. So China is not that much harmed because it's only the Chinese, oil tankers that are now able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And also recently we have heard how India kind of convinced Iran to take some of its oil from there through the stranded, tankers. So China feels not that much, compelled to act directly because it's not economically devastated right now. There's continuous oil, exports from Iran to China. And for Russia as well, Russia is also enjoying the current scene because since oil tankers are stranded in the Strait of Hormuz, there are regulations to lift some of the oil sanctions against Russia. And India was also able to get some Russian oil as to cover up the limitations. And we also hear lots of reports about how Russia and China providing very significant intelligence for Iran to where to strike. So most of these coordinates of US bases, these very strategic radars which keep checking and Iran's attacks and launching the projectiles to stop these attacks. These radars have been hit by precision strikes thanks to the intelligence provided by Russia and China. So we also see this sort of indirect help. Plus, China has been a provider of some of Iran's missile arsenal. So if the resources might be depleting, China may enter into frame there. And Russia may also play a role, a mediation role, especially on the nuclear issue between United States and Iran. We have seen some attempts by Putin. So these are some, let's say, positive developments for Iran in its war effort. But I would like to highlight one significant recent development as well in the United Nations Security Council. So Bahrain actually brought the issue to the agenda of UN Security Council. And there we have a resolution which passed through the council with China and Russia abstaining. They did not veto the resolution, but this resolution is calling for an end of Iranian attacks in the Gulf, and China and Russia did not object to that. So they would like a calmer environment in the Gulf because it's also vital for their security interests. But they can now go in between, so they can have this middle ground approach. But Iran is definitely making use of more indirect support of these actors. But Iran also was always disappointed in terms of their lack of direct involvement. But I think the officials in Tehran understands this, and they are now okay with the current dynamics of intelligence sharing and possible roles they may play later in the mediation efforts.
That's great, and I think we are very short in time. We have a couple minutes, and we might take one more last question. From our colleague from the Department of International Relations, also Dr. Zahra Aziz Bailey, says, thanks for the timely seminar. I would like to ask your opinion on whether the mixed messages coming from the US President Donald Trump stem from rumors of opposition among his own supporters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for this excellent question as well. I think there is a role that Trump's domestic coalition plays on his, sometimes furious, sometimes more calmer messaging. But also, I think there's a role how this strategic ambiguity gives him a room for maneuver to declare the war is over or not over. So by citing a number of these constantly changing objectives, he can say that, US has achieved this, and now to me this is enough, and then we can walk back, and this forever war is not happening in the Middle East. But I would expect the role of these, domestic pressure upon Trump administration if the war drags on, because it is likely to crack down the MAGA, coalition. There is this incoherence between MAGA versus MIGA, and they even question what MIGA stands for. Is it making Iran great again, or is it making Israel great again? So this America firsters I think would become more powerful if the United States faces increasing costs in this war. Plus, I think, US Vice President J.D. Vance has been quite silent in the past 2 weeks because, as we know, he's more on the America first side, and he did not really want this war to happen as much as Israel, wanted. So I think these, officials like J.D. Vance may find greater room to put pressure upon President Trump, if the escalatory dynamics start hurting the United States assets and economy more and more. Thank you.
Okay. I think I can ask my own question.
Sure.
Then, since we're coming to the end. I do have an interesting question here. there have been circulated an analysis. Also, we called that in the narrative, the American narrative, in the changing objectives of the war. Is it a regime change or a regime behavior change? Something similar to the Venezuela one. Is it possible, and how do we see this?
Well, this is also an excellent question. This has been a dilemma, or let's say something that we discuss even in the first Trump administration, I would say, because when he imposed his maximum pressure campaign, as he withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, there was this debate about whether Trump is aiming at a regime change or a change in regime's behavior. So both would be, would be okay with the U.S. administration by then, because if not regime change, perhaps changing the behavior of the regime would also be a win for the administration. And currently, in the context of the ongoing war, obviously, regime change is the ultimate goal, and they would be very happy if this happens. But they understood that it would require more than aerial campaigns, and Iranians are mobilized and they are resilient, and it wouldn't be very easy to do it like they did in Venezuela. So there is no Venezuela scenario in Iran to materialize. So therefore, in this fluctuating narratives, sometimes it is regime change, but most of the time, changes in regime behavior vis-a-vis the use of ballistic missiles and the nuclear program. And they want to guarantee this change of behavior by, totally eliminating the instruments, the means of pursuing this policy. So eliminating Iran's ballistic missiles, eliminating Iran's nuclear program. But then I think they still expect that, first they can start with a change in regime behavior, and they, in the longue durée, I think, are expecting a change in regime itself. And for that, they are creating the, conducive environment by bombing Iran's infrastructure and creating so many structural deficiencies for the state to tackle once the war ends. So even though the regime remains once this war ends, it would face enormous challenges. And this may, in the calculations of Israel and United States, this may later perhaps bring some sort of regime change in Iran. But for that, we need to wait and see.
Thank you. We come to the end of our session today. The time didn't save us that much. We would love to have much more time and hear you and have this kind of discussion. So thank you again for accepting our invitation and for this insightful talk and brief and the comprehensive knowledge behind the whole dimension of this war in the region. So we thank you once again. We thank the audience for tuning in with us, engaging with these beautiful questions in the comment section. And we would like to see you again in more webinars and seminars in the future.
I would like to. My pleasure. So thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our discussions. So this is a momentous time for our region. I think these webinars provide ample opportunity to share our thoughts. So thank you very much for this opportunity and the kind invitation and all these organizations, to you, Abdullah, and to Nur Hocam, and all the audience who joined our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Catching a bus, never nothing when it's real.